welcome back to another webinar here at Route Consultant. If you've never been here before, if you've never met me before, welcome to the new year, 2024, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Josh Gregory. I'm the Vice President of Education here at Route Consultant. And for those of you who have been here before, you'll kind of have a feel for what this webinar is going to look like. But what we'll do today is we're going to go over some new content. We're going to go over some new events, some upcoming listings as well. And then at the end, after we've gone over all of that, we will talk, or we'll open it up for pure Q&A. So if you have a question about anything that I talk about, that my co-host talks about today, or anything at all about the space as a whole, make sure to save it for that Q&A at the end. And if you want us to actually see those questions and answer them, make sure you post them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the window. If you put it in the chat, I'm going to miss it. So if you want us to actually answer those questions when we get there, make sure you put it in the Q&A button, and then we will go through all of those questions, as many questions as you all have, before we end the session today. Now, before I get too far, I do have to quickly read the disclaimer, as I do every week. So Route Consultant is not endorsed by and is not recommended by Federal Express Corporation, FedEx Ground, or Amazon. Route Consultant is not sponsored by, is not approved by, is not associated with, and has no connection whatsoever with Federal Express Corporation, FedEx Ground, or Amazon. So all that to say, we do hope that the rest of this session is educational and that you'll learn today, and also that this can continue to be a place for us to come together, learn, ask questions, and get those questions answered. So what we're going to be talking about today is that we are, just starting the new year. We're just finishing peak season, particularly in the FedEx world. And what we wanted to focus on right now are the things that you should be thinking about and the things that you should be planning for to be successful in the year ahead. And now, if you're a new buyer, you're not there yet, but these are the same types of thought processes you should be having at the beginning of the year once you do have an operation. Now is the time to decide which drivers you'll need and what fleet changes you have to make to be successful. So to help with that conversation, we have brought on Grace Bay, who is the CEO of Patton Logistics and led all of our operations across the country. So she's done this planning a couple of times. So Grace, I see you there. If you just want to say hello to everybody, and we'll get started.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Josh.
Perfect. So we will start really general here. And when we're talking about all these changes, when we're talking about all these planning, when should it happen? Is it right now? Is it later? Is it earlier? What's the best kind of timeline to start thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And time is of the essence as peak volume drops and as the level of, the packages that you're seeing come down the belt, like as soon as that starts to drop, you need to adjust your staffing and your trucks that you're putting on the road to be in line with the volume that's coming down, right? And so since there is some planning involved in that in terms of restructuring your routes, you need to be thinking about that really before that volume shifts back down. And for those of you who have been in this space for a couple of years, you can look at some historical cycles that you've seen in your operation to kind of get an idea of where that January volume number seems to land. For those of you who are newer into this, I would look back at the pre-peak levels and plan for that. And you may have a little bit more of a drop with January being a lighter month. So at least in line with where you were pre-peak, and then plan for probably another 5 to 10% reduction. That's what I'd say.
Okay. Yeah, because January is where it starts to slow down, but there might be a little week or two at the beginning of January where you might still have some returns and some extra volume that spikes. So I think it's great advice, especially as a new buyer. If you're coming in, you're not going to know anything from previous years. So as much of that settlement data that you can get to kind of get a sense of it, and just communications with the seller that you're taking over the business for, just see what they have to say and try to get a sense of that so that you can start that planning process.
Exactly.
Now, do you typically find, like, is this something as an AO you should do alone? Is there anybody else that you should bring into that conversation to help in the planning process?
Yeah, if you are a new buyer, I think it's great advice to talk to the seller and understand what happened for them in prior years so that you can use that historical data to try to plan a little bit better and not have to just forecast from pure projections, but look at historical data. If you've been doing this for a little bit of time and you've got some historical data you can look back to yourself, I mean, certainly everyone should loop in their BCs because that's going to be the person who's executing this plan for you, your managers in your operation. And if you've got anyone on the HR payroll side in your operation, if you're large enough to kind of justify those additional people, they need to be prepared for those conversations that are going to have to happen as you eliminate drivers, making sure that they're handled in an appropriate way, so that you're not dealing with any sort of employee backlash as you make these cuts. But hopefully you have kind of used that seasonal hiring language as you've brought on new drivers, and most of the ones you're parting with, right, are aware that this is a seasonal position. You may be parting with some full-time employees that your HR team or whoever handles that for you needs to have their ducks in a row on the documentation of why you're making that change, just to protect yourself from a HR perspective. But certainly the most important person to loop in is your BC so that you guys are aligned on your efficiency goals at the beginning of the year. I know something that was difficult in our operations for our managers at times, especially newer managers, is, there's this fear that we're going to make all these cuts and the volume really isn't going to go away and we're going to be stuck with more volume than we can handle. And I've just, I've got 8-9 peaks under my belt, and I have never, ever in my entire career in the FedEx space, in the logistics space, seen that happen. So especially for your newer managers, just impress upon them the cyclical nature of these trends, and that January is going to drop. You're not going to be up a creek without a paddle, and make sure that you guys are aligned on your expectations for the volume that each route's going to do so that you're in line with your efficiency metrics.
Yeah, and I think that point is huge. I see it all the time where it's contractors who just decide that as a just in case measure, as contingency, they'll keep everything, and it'll make you feel better until you look at your payroll, until you look at your P&L, and you're basically just going to kill your Q1 in hopes that it helps protect you in the future. And I think I think exactly what you said. It's really important to have that communication and understanding that this isn't going to be something where we find the exact staff that we're going to have forever and it's never going to change, but there's going to have to be constant change that we make throughout the year. And BCs and owners who've been in the space for a while will know that, but you coming in as a new buyer, or if your BC is a little bit greener, that might be a harder conversation to have there.
Yeah. And I've seen instances where, the bleed in January and February is something people are clawing out of all year long. Like it spans past Q1. So I think it's really important for you guys to know what that excess payroll does to your profitability for the year. And it's really painful. So I would not encourage anyone to hold on to that staffing level past, the first or second week of January. Really, the first week of January is where I typically see it.
Yeah. And you mentioned something. So when we're talking about drivers, you mentioned, there's seasonal hires that you might be letting go of, but you also may be evaluating some of your longer term drivers. So at the end of the year, or when you're planning for next year, what are the different factors that you look at in your driver personnel to decide who you're going to keep and who you're going to let go?
Yeah, that's a really important evaluation to make. It sets your operation up for success through, this new year, making sure you have the right players in the right seats. And for me, that conversation really started when we were doing peak hiring, and when we would start having those conversations with our existing team and also new seasonal hires coming in, October-ish. I told everyone that no one's position is going to be guaranteed at the beginning of the year once peak volume is cut. Anyone, whether you are a long-term employee or you're a rookie, everybody has the same opportunity to show me what they got during peak season. And the people who step up and really give it their all are the ones who are going to go into 2024. And that gives you an opportunity to really reset the bar across your team. As some people may have slipped throughout the year and their performance hasn't been as strong as you need it to be. It gives a leveling of the playing field to say, here are my expectations, and the people who meet them and exceed them are going to go with me, and the people who don't, you're going to be cut. And so it sounds strict and intense, but that's what it takes to make it in this space. You have to have your A team on board, and you can't have the tail wagging the dog. And so you kind of have to set that playing field. So those conversations started in October, and then come January, when I'm ready to make cuts, I'm going to look at who was willing to stay out late and help other drivers when they were struggling. I'm going to look at who was willing to say, you know what, I'll take a late night for the team to make this happen. That team mentality is so important in this business because you're never going to have equality over all of your routes, but they all have to get done, right? You can get close on a lot of days, but you have to have a team that's willing to work for the larger success of the organization and not just an individual, my route is all I care about. So that's number one for me. Number two, well, I guess I should say safety is number one, right? So that goes without saying, but safety is number one. So if anyone is having accidents, incidents, frequently, the saying is frequency leads severity. And so even if they haven't been severe yet, yet is the key term there. And you're looking down the barrel at a potential severe accident in the next year, keeping unsafe drivers on your team. Doesn't matter how efficient they are, it's not going to make up for unsafe driving. So that's number one. Look at their safety score, look at incidents and frequency. And then number two, the team player mentality. And then three, I would say efficiency and ability to maximize hours in the day, looking at stops per hour, looking at, if they've got pickups in their route, making sure that they're meeting those windows. So a service element as well, but safety, efficiency, and service levels are really, really important.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a great point there too, where, when you're replacing the people who are on your staff, you might have those people that are kind of your bottom tier, but you're kind of afraid to get rid of them during the year because you don't know who's going to replace them. Peak gives you the opportunity to have tested them in the hardest time of the year. And if those people have succeeded and want to stay on, then that's oftentimes your best opportunity to replace those drivers that are struggling. And so it feels difficult and it's not always fun. It can be severe. It can be tough to have those conversations, but for the health of your business, those are the decisions you often have to make. That's and especially I know a lot of you who are contractors have like a family mentality, and we did too, and it makes it even harder. But those are still the conversations and the decisions you have to make for the business.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, Josh. And I think it kind of dovetails into something I left out, which is important to evaluate, which is toxicity. I mean, that's something that you can't really like measure on your KPIs that you get from FedEx or your indicators or anything like that. But if you've got toxic drivers that are just constantly stirring the pot and creating issues, I know one for us was we had group texts that went on between all the drivers and the managers, and we'd have someone in every operation that would send a snarky comment when a manager asked their drivers to do something. So those types of things, like, definitely take the opportunity to weed that out, because that's not something that gets better if you've given the coaching and it keeps rearing its head. That's something that is going to affect all of your drivers and really spread and kind of kill the culture and the energy of your team. So something there to evaluate as well.
Yeah, I think that's very apparent. If you've ever hired or had one of these teams, you'll know exactly the people we're talking about there. And if you haven't felt that pain, you will at some point. And exactly right. It's never going to go away. Those attitudes typically, only as they get more comfortable, they only get worse. So this is a good time to kind of weed that out. So beyond just drivers, when you're thinking about the route side, is this a time of year that it's also worth pushing your BCs to kind of optimize the route count coming out of peak season? Is that efficiency push something you push on your managers as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great time. I mean, January is such a good time for setting budgets, setting expectations, KPIs, all of that. So you may as well just really get into the practice of making your routes as efficient as you possibly can from the beginning of the year. So for our teams, we always did a new work area planner analysis and just looked at, with the volume that we're expecting to see, what is the optimal route count for the operation. And we all know that there's technology that you got to take with a grain of salt. They don't know that from 3 p.m. until 4 p.m., this portion of the road is totally blocked by a school hookup line, right? Like, the computer doesn't know all of those intricacies of your routes that are going to affect how quickly a route can be done. So, like I always say, with a grain of salt, take that into consideration, but it shouldn't be too off from what you should be able to accomplish in real life. I would say plus minus 1 to 2, depending on the size of your operation. So run a work area planner analysis, see what that spits out and how far away you are on DRO from your, from your work area planner analysis. And if you need some cuts, then make some cuts. It's always a really good idea, in my opinion, to align this with an incentive structure for your manager. So in January, as you are pushing your managers to do uncomfortable things like make cuts and return vehicles, and they're scared to do that, align it with an incentive, right? And so if they have a bonus structure that's tied to efficiency or hitting certain payroll metrics with their team, and you can kind of show them how they get from route count X to payroll of Y, and that leads to bonus for them, then that's going to be a great, way to incentivize them to go ahead and apply these efficiencies that you need them to start the year off with.
Yeah, and it just goes to what we always say, that make sure your bonuses are aligned to what you need in your bottom line and your P&L, so that it's not, you're not just giving money for no reason. It's something that helps the business overall, and that's a great way to do it. The other thing too, just as a reminder, if you haven't looked at Work Area Planner in a while, or if you're new and don't know what that is, it's even more important now that efficiency is a part of the metal system. So this is a great time to just go in and see, like Grace is saying, there's always going to be a difference between what that says in reality based on your territory, but that's what FedEx is looking at. And so when they're having those conversations with you about your efficiency, and you want to be able to understand where they're coming from so that you can explain that difference. And if you haven't done that analysis in a while, this is a great time to do it.
Yep, exactly.
So the other part of this equation, besides the drivers, is the fleet. So when you're headed into the new year, what are the things you're thinking about around your vehicles? What are the things you're doing at this time of year to prepare that fleet for next year?
Yeah, I definitely always encourage you to look at which trucks are costing you the most money, right? Because we've all, I think, fallen victim to just paying the repair and maintenance bill for certain units that probably need to be cycled out of our fleet, and it's costing us more to maintain them than it is to replace them. So for sure, identify, I'd say, the bottom 10 to 20%. And by the bottom, I mean your most expensive to maintain trucks, or the ones that you're anticipating some sort of major mechanical issue in the impending future, like an engine that's going to be blown, a transmission. I know we don't always anticipate that, but you can look at the mileage and you can look at the use and say, we may be getting close, right? And so anywhere between the, 150 to 200,000 miles, that's when I start to get a little antsy about keeping that truck in a daily used position. Certainly there's a spot for some of those vehicles to be spares. Depending on the size of your operation, that'll dictate how many spares you should have. But with the bottom 10%, I'd say it's a good practice to either look at replacing that with new units, with leased units, or with slightly used units on higher mileage routes. So it's good to just do a full analysis of that and evaluate, where am I spending money and how could I potentially eliminate some of that spend?
Yeah, and now we talked just a second ago how you might eliminate a couple of routes. If at the beginning of the year volume's lower, we talked about how it doesn't make sense to keep on a bunch of extra drivers from a payroll perspective. Let's say you're down a few routes. Do you find that it's better to sell extra vehicles or keep those as spares?
Yeah, I don't think that it makes sense to sell them if you anticipate your volume to continue being, in line with or a little bit in excess of what you've experienced prior year. Now, if you ran prior year with 10 extra trucks sitting around, absolutely, it's probably a good idea to sell a couple of those or to look at some other options. But if you were pretty close to in line with where you needed to be last year, and January is just a little bit light, February is a little bit light, keep those around as spares, and that gives you a little bit of room for organic growth throughout the year, or potentially even taking on some additional work if that's available in your area.
That's perfect.
Certainly no rentals. Absolutely no rentals. Get rid of those.
Get rid of those as soon as you can after peak season.
As soon as you can. And that's something that is a gotcha that really, really, really hurts you. Because rentals run anywhere from like $300 to $400 a week, I believe. And so if you are expecting your team to prioritize returning those vans for you, you need to stay on top of that, because in their mind, they don't understand the cost of delaying that return by a day or two. And then all of a sudden it's next week. And that's something that I actually gave a bonus to our managers. And then when we got large enough, to our fleet manager, of how quickly those got returned, because they didn't realize the impact of their decision to push it and just let them sit. And sometimes they forget about it. And they're, you all know, for those of you who are in the FedEx space, you walk into the terminal in the mornings and 75 things are thrown at you the moment you walk in. And so you forget about, oh shoot, I needed to return that van. Now they're closed. It's just, it can get away from you. So definitely keep your eye on that and make sure you're asking daily, did this get returned? Did this get returned? Did this get returned, until all of them are back, because it will bite you if you don't.
Especially if you're out of multiple terminals, if you're kind of thinking about this and you're not as invested in the day to day, you've got BCs at different places, it's where it's even easier to let stuff like that slip.
Yeah.
So trucks and drivers, that's the main thing. Is there anything else you're thinking about? Is it either budget, vendors, any of those types of things that it's also worth reevaluating at this time of year?
Yeah, I think it's really important to reevaluate your managers. And that's something that is a scary thing to talk about no matter what time of year it is. But if you are going to make a replacement or a change, or even just do some additional training and coaching, January is the best time to do that, because volume is going to be light. You'll get through kind of the major changes. And then whether you bring in someone new or you promote someone, they're going to have somewhat of a new-ish, fresher team, where some of those drivers may not be, loyal to the prior BC or have a ton of history, that you've got some fresh blood in there. And so it's a great opportunity to make a management change and have that manager really lead that team from the beginning, or at least that team as it's going to exist in 2024 or whatever year this is. And so I would definitely evaluate your manager. If it is additional training that's needed, this is going to be the lowest volume season, where you can really make sure your manager is off a route. And maybe that is an instance where you do keep one additional driver on for a few weeks, so that you really can pull your manager completely out of potentially having to run a route, run overflow, do some of those additional things. And you can really spend some time building that manager up and making him or her exactly what you need them to be this year. Because just like the rental scenario, in the FedEx space and the logistics space, like they just get away from you if you don't prioritize them, because everything is so immediate and there are so many things that just fly at you every minute of the day. And so if you aren't really intentional with that and set the space and the priority and the time to do it, it's not going to happen any other time of the year. And if you've kind of had that feather feeling in the back of your mind of like, oh, my manager's okay, but I don't know that they're the right fit, like this is the time.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is the scariest thing to be thinking about, of how do I replace that BC is the critical part of my day. But this is the easiest time to do it. It's never going to be easy though. It's never going to feel like a great decision, because there's always a lot of resources, a lot of time invested in that person. It may be time that is not valuable for you, that you're kind of having to spend on them, but it's still hard to make the decision and make the change. But like Grace said, this is the easiest time. It's the slowest time, and it's the time where making changes is the least painful. It's still going to be painful. You just have to make the decision to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've got two more things actually, Josh, to talk about here. So, just as you're evaluating your BC, I think it's also important to evaluate the size of your business and the potentially new needs that it has going into this year. So if you've experienced any substantial growth in, from the beginning of 2023 to the beginning of 2024, you may be in a position where you really need a fleet manager, or you really need a back office admin HR person, or you really need a dedicated recruiter for your operation. So I think spending some time reflecting on that and saying, are the needs of my operation met, or do I have someone like a manager or someone in my organization who's extremely overwhelmed in all of the different hats they have to wear, because we've grown to a size where they just can't manage all of those hats across all of the drivers, all of the routes. So definitely evaluate that, see if that's something you may need to add a hire for. And then in reverse, if you've scaled back, if there's anything that your organization has but doesn't really need anymore. Maybe if you have had a fleet manager, or if you have had a dedicated recruiter, it might be more cost effective if you've sold a piece of your business or scaled back, to outsource those things and bring in technology or a vendor to do those things for you. So I say that, being complacent and just keeping things the way they've always been is the easiest way to lose money in this space. You have to constantly be evaluating what you're spending your money on and if it's giving you back, what you need from it, or because we just don't have room for any sort of fluff or fat. You have to constantly be cutting when you need to cut and adding when you need to add. And that just requires constant oversight and maintenance of your expenses, looking at your P&Ls regularly, weekly, and kind of trying to reduce any sort of lag time between real time when things are happening and then when you're able to look at the financials. 2 weeks in arrears is probably prime time of where you need to be. So, and then the second thing I was going to say, let's see. So we did managers for evaluation. We did size and scale of business. I may need to come back to you on this one, Josh. It's escaped my brain at this moment, but
That's fine. We've got plenty of Q&A that you'll have to think it through. So we hit a lot of things right there, and there's plenty more detail we could add on any of it. So we're going to get to Q&A in just a second, where you'll be able to ask any other questions you have. Real quick though, I'm going to go over some new listings and new events, but as I'm talking, feel free, any questions you have, to go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and Grace and I will get to them in just a second. So first, just a couple of new listings that came out today. The first is out of Florida, Southern Florida, and it's an Amazon business. So 40 Amazon routes at $990,000. This is one with multiple managers in place to help with daily operation. And if you aren't familiar with Amazon, the full fleet is leased and comes with the business. It's something provided by Amazon. So it is a little bit different structure, but if you have questions on that and you're looking for routes out of Florida, that one is Amazon. Next one is Central Michigan. These are 16 FedEx P&D routes at $1,050,000. This one has a manager, 3 spare trucks, and has some assumable truck debt as well. And it's got a full-time manager that handles all the daily operations. So if that's what you're looking for, there's also spares in the business as a part of it to make that transition easier for you. And then the last one we have this week is out of northern New Mexico. This is 13 P&D routes, $775,000. 2 managers, a huge set of spare trucks, 16 spare trucks here with a really low mileage operation, and 2 managers. So a low entry point and a lot of spare resources as you're getting into this space. So those are the 3 new listings this week: New Mexico, Michigan, and Florida. If you have questions on any of them, reach out to our team. We can give you all the details. We also quickly just wanted to highlight upcoming events. So all of our happy hours are now posted on our website for the whole year. You can register for them. They're completely free to attend. It is a place for networking for both buyers and contractors in an area. And like I said, free to attend. We'll have the food, we'll have the drinks, and all of those for the whole year are on our website. So if you're looking for that list, you can go ahead and see and register in advance. Another thing too, we've had new investor summits for years, and typically those have been in-person events, and those are designed as a way for new investors who are getting into the space to really understand what they're walking into and to be confident about making that step into the FedEx space or the Amazon. And we're going to have summits for a few different verticals this year. But importantly, instead of those being in person, they're now going to be completely on demand. So if you go to the website, you can sign up for the summit immediately and jump in immediately. And beyond that, we're going to have anyone who comes to those summits, there's going to be some on-site sessions included with that, but you will be able to have access to that information, those videos, that content immediately if you do want to attend a summit now. Last thing to just always mention is that the expo is still coming up. The expo that we do every year, if you've never been to it, it's our huge contractor party that we have. We've had it in Vegas the last couple of years. We're in Dallas this year. And so it is, again, free to attend. We'll provide all the food, all of the content, all of the drinks. All you have to do is get there. And that's important because that hotel block does sell out. So if you want to go ahead and register, that is up as well. And you can go ahead and register for the expo and book your room. Okay, so those are the events and the upcoming content. I'm going to jump into the Q&A because Grace actually has to leave a little bit early. So I want to try to get to as many of these, and then I'll still be here to answer questions after. So Grace, we'll start with an easy one. Where do you find work area planner?
Ooh, okay, so it's just a website, and the link to it to log in is the same as your FedEx ID. So maybe we could send that in the chat, Josh.
We can send you some details afterwards, and as far as actually where it is in MyGroundBiz, but we can help you with all of that. There are some videos, there's some stuff we can send. So if you'll just reach out to info@routeconsultant.com if you're trying to find it, we'll send you the exact method of getting there. So here's one from David. So coming out of peak season, let's say you have a new employee that's a rock star that we've been talking about, and you want to have him or her replace someone who's not as good. So how do you do that and then not expose yourself to any litigation from the driver that you're firing?
Yeah, great question. I think this is a really good time to impress upon everyone the importance of documenting performance issues. It's something that can get away from all of us in the busy, hectic nature of this world. But missed pickup windows, customer service complaints, disputes, service under your threshold that you set for your organization. If it's 99, if it's 99.6, you can pull all of that after the fact and create a case after the fact and produce that upon the termination. I think it's better if you can show that you've had documented conversations with the underperforming driver about these things. But all of this data is available on MyGroundBiz. So you can always pull the daily service worksheet and document what days were under service. You can pull your accident history if they've had any accidents. Anything like that is something you can use. And then if it's more of a attitude issue that they're being let go for, or something that isn't as quantifiable, that's really where we need to be able to show those documented conversations to say, hey, we had a coaching incident with driver, John, about his tardiness or about the insubordination to management. So those things I would like to see documented, but honestly, it's not necessary. It just is an extra protection as you're making those changes.
Yeah, and I'll just, as a quick plug, next week we're going to be talking a lot about risk management and culture management in this time of the year too, how it relates to the different things you need to be building into your business, into your employee handbook. So if you have more questions on that, we're going to have a whole webinar on it next week as well. Question here from Will. So what's the best way, if you have a driver that you're firing, or if you have one that quits, to prevent multiple other drivers from following, to create any kind of landslide effect there? How do you protect yourself?
Yeah. So there are a bunch of different scenarios where this happens. But I think the fastest way is stay bonuses. If you've got drivers who are skittish or scared or, wanting to walk for whatever reason, you can always whip out a stay bonus as I use that as my last ditch effort, because I don't want drivers thinking that they can just hold me over a barrel and say, I'm leaving and I'm just going to throw money at them. So I would sparingly and also spread it out over time to make sure you're getting the value of them staying. And you may ultimately want to replace them anyway if they've kind of pulled that on you. So it just buys you time to be able to replace that driver so that they're not walking and you're having to replace at the same time. So not my favorite. I don't love it culturally. It's just something that is a last ditch effort. And then, in terms of losing drivers when you're making these cuts, like if at the beginning of the year, you need to cut 4 drivers, and leading up to that, I think it's really important to have conversations with your team once the terminations are done to say, this is it. There's no more coming from a volume perspective, right? We've made the cuts. This is the team that we're walking into this year with. So everyone can rest easy and not think that, gosh, I'm next. I'm going to show up to work and it's going to be me tomorrow. Because that's what's going to, that sort of, fear in their mind is what's going to lead them to look for other opportunities, because they'll say, well, these 4 drivers were just let go. What's going to happen to my job? So definitely communicating when they're done is important. And I always give the caveat of barring performance issues, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're saying no more terminations for the next quarter. And then you have somebody, have a ridiculous accident. You got to let them go. So barring any sort of performance issues. And also, if there's a follow-up question where you want to ask a specific example, happy to talk about that too. But those are the main ones that I see.
Okay, we got one here from Luke. So he's got a mix of rural and urban routes. So he's got cutaways and step vans. So how do you think about the ratio of spare trucks to routes that you ran and what you would aim for there?
Okay, good question. I think that it's honestly maybe not more important, but just as important as like number of spares is type of spares, right? And so if you have a varied route, makeup in your territory where you're using a lot of different types of trucks, I think it's important to have one of, your major types, right? So you wouldn't want to have all cutaway spares. You wouldn't want to have all step van spares, because if you have routes that require one of each type, then make sure you have spares that can kind of plug and play into any one of your routes pretty well. And then from a number perspective, I would say at least one per 5 to 8 trucks is usually where I'd land.
Perfect. Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's one of those two where it's we can give ratios, but it's always going to come down to your specific fleet and territory. So if you have really specific questions there about what you're running, you reach out to our team, because there's always going to be nuance when it comes to actually looking at the fleet in your territory.
And there's a rural and, urban component there too that we could add as one other generalization to look to. So if you've got new trucks in a low mileage territory, that's going to be something where you may not really need that many spares, maybe like one. But if you've got high mileage, you've got some used trucks that you're operating and you see frequent breakdowns, you're going to need more.
So another one here from Will. So you talked about fleet managers. Is that something that only works if you have multiple different contracts or just one large contract? Is there a threshold you would look for size of business before looking at a fleet manager?
Yeah, I that's another one that is really specific about your operation, which we can dig in with you on that. But generally, I'd say I started to see value once we had 3 to 4 contracts is where we landed, and we may could have done it a little bit sooner. I actually don't think we did it until we had 5. But in this scenario where you can't quite justify the expense, I would look at maybe having a lead driver within one of your operations who is more mechanically inclined. So if you're recruiting for drivers, that's something, a vendor like Bright Flag or whoever you use for your recruiting, they can help you really refine that search to try to find somebody who is mechanically inclined and wouldn't mind doing some lighter maintenance, like light bulbs and oil changes and stuff like that that you don't necessarily want to have to take in to get done, but you need somebody who somewhat knows what they're doing, right? So lead drivers are a good just stopgap, or even a BC who is mechanically inclined to get you over the hurdle until you can justify a fleet manager.
Yeah, perfect. So I'll ask one more question for you because this one's definitely for you, Grace. So what is your go-to record on your turntable behind you?
Oh my gosh. I have so many, but this one actually was a present from Leland, our CFO. It's a Beatles record, but you got to
Perfect.
ring in the new year with the classics, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to hold you up. I'll still stay for all the rest of the questions here for everybody. But Grace, thank you so much for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you and have be here to answer all of our clients' questions.
Thanks, Josh. Bye, y'all.
All right. So we do still have a few questions here. So first one here is from Alfred. So are there any recommendations on software for route consolidation? So yes, there's a lot of really good vendors in this space. The biggest ones that we typically see are Ground Cloud, Beans Routes, Package Routes. You can look at all of them. A lot of it's going to kind of come down to what you're using already. Especially the people who go to Ground Cloud are often because they're already using Ground Cloud for like their vetter or something else. So what I would do is look at a few of them and decide which one works best for you, decide which one is the best fit into your organization. And if you have questions on how to contact any of them or referrals, we can help with that as well. So one here from Ed. So this is a bigger question. So when you're thinking about post-peak review and adjustments, is any of our advice different when we're talking about line haul as opposed to P&D? For the most part, no. So your thought process should still be the same types of things. This is the really excellent time of year to take a look at your drivers, at your trucks, at your vendors, at your BCs at a slower time of the year and make those adjustments. Now, what I will say though is, in particular, finding drivers for on the line haul side can be the hardest part. It's recruiting is always going to be your biggest challenge in the line haul side, or at least one of your biggest challenges. So, and those are CDL drivers. Those are often more competitive to keep those drivers. So if you know that there are opportunities at any of the terminals you're operating out of, any additional runs or spots or anything that you can put those drivers on, then I would still be trying to get that growth instead of letting go of those drivers, because your biggest obstacle to being able to grow is to continue to have drivers and resources that you can put on those. So you may be a little bit more hesitant to just eliminate the drivers. What may happen though is that maybe if there's any kind of volume shortage, you may not, those drivers just might not be making any money. If they're comfortable with that for a period of time, if they have other jobs or other things they can be doing in that period, it might be better to just try to get them to wait it out where they're not costing you a lot. But you know that you might lose them, as opposed to just proactively eliminating them if you think there's any opportunity for securing that growth. But for the most part, you do want to have the same types of mindsets, the same types of conversations with your drivers, with your BCs about how you'll optimize for the new year. It's just going to look a little bit different, because instead of route optimization, you may be looking at runs and where are the right places, especially if you're out of multiple terminals, which of my runs are the most profitable, which of these terminals are the ones that I want to dig in and really focus on growing in the new year. Are there any new terminals that I want to get into? All of those things are still the conversations that you should be having. And January is typically the best time to do it while you've got the right perspective. Volume's a little slower so that those changes are less painful. Another one here from Ed. Is it typical in the new year for a lot of new routes to be put up for sale? Yes. And the reason for it is often what so the way we do valuations in particular is we're not including any peak data in that volume. And so typically we're looking at routes or at data from before October, or it's contractors who, coming out of peak season, decided, hey, that was really tough. I don't want to do another peak season. So in January, I'm going to give you all my information and we're going to go from there. So we do find that a lot of contractors coming out of peak season decide maybe that's their last year because peak season's tougher. And so we will, over the first couple of months of the year, see a lot of the new listings go live. All right. Good question here from Brian. So if you're looking at buying a remote operation with a manager in place, does FedEx require you to live within a certain radius of the route? Are there terminal managers on any kind of regular basis where attendance is mandatory? So what I will say is there's no real, letter of the law that is specific to the contract about how this works. There's nothing in the contract saying if you're not within 100 miles of the terminal, if you're not at a meeting every week, then you can't have the contract. What I will say is that your terminal managers are going to dictate what that looks like. We have the rule of thumb of trying to, I would be within 5 hours of your first operation on the P&D side, so that you can get there in the event of emergency or for any kind of meeting. Line haul, it's a little looser, but the caveat there is that there are going to be terminal managers with different preferences, and they will enforce those, or they will, in the interview and when you're first talking to them, be really aggressive about making sure you understand that. A good way to figure out what that terminal's manager wants or expects is, one, they'll probably tell you in the interview. But before that, if you're evaluating one of these before you've actually had the interview, is ask the seller if there's anyone else at the terminal who operates remotely. Ask the seller if the terminal manager currently requires them to come in every week, or if it's a quarterly thing. I would expect at minimum to be there quarterly on the P&D side and on the line haul side for any kind of business review for the quarter. It may be more often than that, and most likely should be, especially if it's your first P&D operation. I'd want you to be more involved in the first one so that you understand the business before you start to pull back and operate more remotely. Because no matter what, you're going to be involved. It's just a matter of where you're physically located. But the amount of involvement you'll have and how often you're actually going to have to be on site is typically going to be a function of that terminal manager's preferences. In a lot of ways, terminal managers are kind of the princes of their own little kingdoms, and they get to kind of set their policies and their priorities. And so while it's not a contractual thing, they may not approve you in the interview process, or it may be something where they're much less forgiving if you are not in the terminal very often. So it's really important to understand kind of the personality and the priorities of that terminal manager as you're deciding what your operational style will be. Question here from Will. Is there any utilization of AI in the last mile industry that it's openly available? I would say yes. Now, what I would say though is openly available, probably no. There are several vendors that have technology, both P&D and line haul, that is using AI that's really effective and impressive. I would not say that there's any kind of free open AI software that anybody's using or that is something I would necessarily recommend, but there are vendors that are using it and experimenting with it. I've seen great results from several of them. So it is something being looked at and used, but it's going to be mostly behind each of those individual vendors' paywalls. And so whether you're in P&D or line haul or Amazon or any other space, it just depends on what you're looking at. We can give recommendations there depending on where you're looking. Okay, next one here is from Terry. So he sees some routes that routinely have 3 or more managers. Why would you do this? Does it help with remote ownership? And what does it mean when a route has one but similar sized vans and routes as a 3+ managed route? So when you're thinking about number of managers, there's a lot of reasons an owner might have multiple. So typically we recommend having 1 manager when you get to about 8 routes, and it often makes sense to have 2 when you're up to 16 or more, and 3 if there's a variety of things that could go into deciding what to do there. Part of it could be if there is a terminal or if there's a contract with multiple locations, you'll often want at least 1 BC on site at each of those terminals. So that could be the case. I'm not familiar with the exact routes you're referring to. It could also be that those managers are covering different things. So sometimes we'll see, like what we talked about earlier, there may be a fleet manager that's primarily focused on the maintenance of the vehicles. There may be a safety manager that does the safety meetings each week. And there may be one that's kind of more of a general manager overseeing things like DRO and scheduling, maybe hiring. A lot of what it's going to come down to when you're thinking about the managers is you're going to look at what are the operational tasks that are involved in the business as it is. What are the things that you are capable of as the AO? And then what are the things that you would rather put on the BC, either because they're better at it or it's not worth your time to do? That, there's a lot of those decisions that you'll want to make. And it could be at this operation with 3 managers that they're forced into it because they're out of multiple locations. Or it could be that there's a few different tasks like safety and the fleet that they've offloaded to these managers because they're better at it and it helps their bottom line. Or it just gives the owner time back in their day and they'd rather have time than deal with those specific things related to the business. So a lot of it is decision based on what you're comfortable with. Do you want to spend time or do you want to have someone else do it? And those are decisions you'll always be making as an owner in this space. Line haul is a little bit different. You're usually not having multiple managers unless you are out of multiple terminals. But even then, sometimes your managers can handle dispatch for, a few different terminals depending on the size of your operation. But a manager can be a great fill-in, a great backup driver if they have their CDL. So really what it comes down to for P&D and line haul is that when you're thinking about the manager, and what they're doing, it comes down to your time. And it also comes down to the demands of the operation, how large you are, how many different terminals you're out of, and why that might look different for 2 similar sized businesses is because one might have, a variety of things that are problems, the fleet or the safety, or it could just be that owner wanted to offload more of the duties to someone else besides them. Oftentimes too, in those operations with 3 managers, 1 or multiple of them are driving in addition to some of those managerial duties. So they're kind of doing split tasks there. Okay, that was the last question. So I think we've gotten to everyone's questions today. So again, we mentioned a few events, we mentioned some new listings, we mentioned a lot of things in the webinar around content and questions. If you need additional help or if you want any follow-up on any of those events, any of those listings, any of the things that we talked about today in your business, you feel free to reach out to our team. info@routeconsultant.com is the easiest way and we will help you from there. But other than that, thanks everyone for joining this week, and we will see you again next week on our next webinar. Thanks, everybody.